We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again. That was the formula Nathaniel Greene scrawled in a letter to George Washington. He wrote it after losing another battle. He wrote it after watching British cannons tear through his lines. He wrote it knowing he would lose again. And he was right. He lost nearly every major engagement he ever commanded. Yet when the war army that had pursued him was gutted, its remnants huddled in two coastal enclaves, trapped and irrelevant. The interior of the Carolinas belonged to Greene. He never won a battlefield. He won the war. On December 3, 1780, Major General Nathaniel Greene arrived at Charlotte, North Carolina. He was 38 years old. He had a pronounced limp from a childhood accident. He had been a Quaker ironworker who taught himself military strategy by candlelight. And he had just been handed command of the Southern Department of the Continental Army. The army he inherited was a ruin. 4 months earlier, General Horatio Gates had marched the Southern Army into catastrophe at Camden, South Carolina. Gates fled the field on horseback. He rode 160 miles in 3 days to escape. His army disintegrated behind him. Out of roughly 3,700 men, over 1,000 were killed or wounded. Another 1,000 were captured. The survivors scattered across the Carolina backcountry. When Greene counted heads in December, he found approximately 2,300 men fit for duty. Most were militia. They lacked shoes, blankets, and ammunition. Their uniforms hung in rags. Discipline had collapsed. Desertion was routine. Morale was non-existent. The British High Command looked at this wreckage and saw a finished theater. Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis commanded His Majesty's forces in the South. He had crushed Gates at Camden. He had captured Charleston in May with an entire American army of over 5,000 men. He had occupied the major ports and inland posts across South Carolina and Georgia. His cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton had terrorized the countryside. Cornwallis believed the southern colonies were pacified. His plan was straightforward. March north into North Carolina, rally loyalist militias, and roll up the rebellion from the south. Then link up with British forces in Virginia and strangle the revolution entirely. London agreed. Reinforcements were en route. The Southern strategy was working. What Cornwallis did not account for was the limping Quaker standing in Charlotte with a broken army and a radical idea. Greene surveyed his situation. He had roughly 1/3 the combat power of Cornwallis's main force. His troops were starving, under-equipped, and unreliable. Conventional military doctrine in the 18th century demanded that a commander in Greene's position either fight a defensive battle or retreat to safety and regroup. But Greene looked at the map and saw something his critics missed. He saw rivers that flooded in February. He saw roads that turned to mud in winter. He saw supply lines stretching hundreds of miles through hostile territory. He saw that he did not need to beat Cornwallis in battle. He needed to exhaust him. His first act as Southern commander was not to attack. It was to retreat. He would not risk his fragile army in a decisive engagement. He would fall back when pressed. He would fight only when the ground favored him. He would trade space for time and time for British casualties. The move violated every instinct of an 18th century officer trained to seek glory on the battlefield. But Greene was not seeking glory. He was seeking victory. And his method would produce one of the strangest statistical records in military history. Over the next 10 months, Nathaniel Greene fought a series of pitched battles against the main British army in the South. He lost at Guilford Courthouse. He was repulsed at Hobkirk's Hill. He failed to take the fort at 96. He fought to a bloody draw at Eutaw Springs. That is 0 decisive victories. And yet by September of 1781, the British had abandoned every inland post they held when Greene took command. Their total casualties from his campaign exceeded 2,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Cornwallis's exhausted army limped to the Virginia coast, seeking resupply. Within weeks, it would be trapped at a place called Yorktown. Greene did not destroy the British army by destroying it on the field. He destroyed it by making it destroy itself. Every mile Cornwallis marched toward Greene cost him men, horses, and wagons. Every battle Greene lost cost Cornwallis soldiers he could never replace. Every week the campaign dragged on, strangled British logistics a little more. The mechanism was simple and brutal. Greene retreated constantly. He retreated north across the Dan River into Virginia. He retreated after Guilford Courthouse. He retreated after Hobkirk's Hill. And every retreat pulled Cornwallis further from his supply bases, deeper into hostile territory, and closer to total exhaustion. Greene understood what Cornwallis could not afford to learn. In this war, in this terrain, the army that stayed on its feet longest was the army that won. The camp at Charlotte was a collection of mud-chinked huts and ragged tents stretched across frozen ground. Snow fell in thin flurries on December 3, 1780. Horses stood rib-visible in the cold, their feed running low. Greene walked the lines himself on his first day. He saw men wrapped in blankets because they had no coats. He saw feet bound in rags where shoes had rotted away months earlier. He saw muskets with rusted locks that would not spark. The quartermaster's stores contained exactly 0 barrels of salt pork. The ammunition reserve held fewer than 3 rounds per man. Sickness had ripped through the camp while the army sat idle. Dysentery and typhus spread through the crowded shelters. Hundreds lay on straw pallets, too weak to stand for muster. The hospital was a single farmhouse with no medicine, no bandages, and no surgeon worth the name. A third of the men listed on the rolls were absent at any given moment. Some were genuinely ill. Others had simply walked away. Desertion was not a crime in this army. It was a rhythm. A man would serve his short enlistment, collect what pay he could, and vanish into the backcountry. His place would be taken by another farmer who would do the same in 3 months. The militia were the worst of it. Greene had approximately 1,500 militia on paper spread across the region. They carried their own weapons and wore their own clothes. They elected their own officers from among their neighbors. They fought when they felt like fighting and went home when they felt like going home. Crossing a state border was a non-starter for most of them. A North Carolina militiaman would defend his county with ferocity, but ask him to march into South Carolina and he would remind you that his farm was the other direction. His enlistment paper explicitly limited his service to his home state. He had planted his crops and he intended to harvest them. A British column 50 miles away was someone else's problem. The Continental regulars were better, but only marginally. They had enlisted for longer terms and received formal training from experienced officers. But they had not been paid in months. Some had not been paid in over a year. Their families back home were suffering while they shivered in the Carolina winter. Congress had no money. The states sent promises instead of supplies. Every morning, Greene received reports from his officers listing the men who had slipped away in the night. The numbers piled up. A captain reported 9 gone. A colonel reported 30 missing from a regiment of 200. Greene sat at a borrowed desk in a farmhouse on the outskirts of Charlotte. He wrote to George Washington on December 7, 1780. He described the army as wretched beyond description. He told Washington the men were literally naked, not a figure of speech. He meant that some soldiers owned no trousers. He listed the shortages. No tents, no camp kettles, no entrenching tools, no cartridge boxes for the few cartridges they had. His artillery consisted of 3 field pieces, not brigades, not batteries. 3 guns total, and one had a cracked carriage that would shatter on its next firing. Cornwallis had over 20 cannon with full ammunition trains. Greene did not sugarcoat the numbers. Cornwallis commanded roughly 4,000 veteran regulars south of Charlotte. Additional British garrisons occupied Charleston, Camden, 96, and Augusta. Tarleton's Legion alone, with its green-jacketed cavalry and fast-moving infantry, outnumbered Greene's entire mounted force. A pitched battle against any of these formations would end as Camden had ended. Greene told Washington he would not seek one. He outlined his alternative. He called it a war of posts. The idea was to avoid concentration against concentration. Instead, he would spread his limited forces to threaten multiple British positions simultaneously. If Cornwallis moved against one post, Greene would strike at another. If Cornwallis concentrated to attack, Greene would fall back toward his supply base in Virginia. If Cornwallis divided his force, Greene would look for an opening against an isolated detachment. The terrain was the key to making it work. The Carolina interior was a maze of rivers running roughly parallel from the mountains to the sea. The Catawba, the Yadkin, the Dan. Each one was a natural defensive barrier. In winter, they flooded wide and fast. Crossing them required boats or fords that only locals knew. Greene intended to use every river as a wall between himself and Cornwallis. He would make the British commander fight geography before he earned the right to fight men. Time was the other variable Greene meant to weaponize. Every week Cornwallis spent marching through this country cost him supplies he could not replace locally. His wagons had to haul everything from Charleston, 200 miles of bad roads. His horses died on the march, and there were no fresh ones to requisition from hostile farms. His wounded accumulated with no secure place to leave them. A British army in motion was a British army bleeding resources. Greene just had to stay in front of it long enough. The first thing he did was enforce discipline. He ordered morning muster at dawn for every unit, no exceptions. He had officers inspect weapons daily and report shortages immediately. He placed guards around the supply tents and court-martialed looters. The men grumbled. The militia in particular resented being treated like regulars. Some officers complained that Greene was too strict, too formal, too continental for an army of backwoodsmen. Greene ignored them. He had seen what lax discipline did at Camden. He had watched Gates's army dissolve into a mob because no one maintained order. He would not repeat that mistake. He turned next to the partisans. The Carolinas were crawling with irregular bands who had been fighting the British on their own for months. Francis Marion operated out of the swamps of the Santee River Basin in South Carolina. Thomas Sumter raided British supply convoys with a hardened force of mounted riflemen in the upcountry. Andrew Pickens commanded influence among the frontier settlements. These men had no formal commission from Greene. They had no supply line, no payroll, and no interest in taking orders from a continental general. They fought their own war by their own rules. Greene needed them, not as an army, as a swarm. He wrote to Marion on December 4th. He wrote to Sumter on December 6th. He wrote to Pickens shortly after. Each letter struck the same tone. He offered supplies the Continental Commissary could barely spare. He offered ammunition from his own dangerously low stock. He asked in return that they coordinate their raids with his movements. He did not order. He requested. A direct command to a man like Sumter would be ignored at best and insulting at worst. Cooperation had to be earned. The partisan leaders had seen Continental generals come and go. They had watched Gates arrive with bluster and leave on horseback. They were cautious, but they were also exhausted. They had been fighting without support for years. A general who offered powder and shot without demanding subordination was something new. Marion wrote back first. He would continue his operations and inform Greene of British movements when possible. Sumter took longer to respond, but eventually signaled willingness. Pickens nodded his assent through intermediaries. It was not a unified command. It was a network of grudges and common interests, held together by a single man writing letters by candlelight in a frozen farmhouse. Greene was building a machine, not a machine that crushed the enemy in battle, a machine that pulled the enemy apart piece by piece. The British would have to guard 100 miles of road. They would have to garrison every outpost against partisan strikes. They would have to chase a continental army that refused to stand still. And all the while the river crossings would freeze, the wagons would sink in mud, and the winter would eat Cornwallis's army one soldier at a time.